Hi there guys, Ken here, your Thrifty apprentice. Today we are going to be doing a watercolor painting of some tomatoes. I made a post on my Facebook page maybe a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago, saying that a tomato was a fruit, fight me. Just to be funny and have some fun with a couple of friends on social media. And it kind of, I ran across that post today when I was looking on Facebook, and it just kind of flashed an image in my head of some tomatoes. So I said, hey, I'm going to paint some tomatoes, and we're going to be using watercolor crayons and watercolor pencils and some gouache to do this painting. And once again, I am going to be testing this little journal that I got off of Amazon. This is going to be the third painting in that I'm doing. And I've already sketched my tomatoes out here and kind of erased them a bit to lighten the lines. But I'm going to be drawing out the tomato with you guys just to show you how to do it. So really quick, I'm going to grab this scrap paper here, and I start out by drawing just a little M. I'm going to draw dark. You guys can actually draw this on sketch paper and transfer it to your watercolor paper, or you can draw it on the watercolor paper really lightly if you do that. So I'm just going to sketch in some leaves here for the tomato. And I'm not being too exact about anything, but because I want it to look a bit natural. And so you get the point. You would just draw the leaves, and then I'm going to go, say a 1/4 of an inch back to start actually drawing in the tomato here. Do the same thing to this side. It would come out here. We're just going to round this off. And that's how I would draw my tomato. I hope that's been in frame. And then these would be, that would come there, and this would come this way. I hope this is frame. You guys were able to see that. Darken it up just a little bit more, so you could see what's going on. Just dry the tomato. There we go. So that's how we would do that. Okay, so now that I've shown you guys how to draw out the composition, I just took mine and I sketched out 3 different tomatoes here, and I've already kind of put under the area where we're going to be using the shadow. And the video is going to go into time lapse, but it's not going to be sped up much at all. I'm only going to speed it up maybe double time. And then I'm going to voice the video over because it is raining outside and there's going to be a lot of noise going on around the house as well. But I did want to kind of do this part in real time so you guys could see what we were using, where the composition idea came from, and to just kind of sketch out a tomato with you guys so you could see how to do it. All right, so let's get to painting. So as we start off here, I am grabbing I believe that is Scarlet Supracolor Soft Caran D'Ache pencil, and I'm just going to go ahead and sketch in my tomatoes with that. The other colors with the watercolor pencils that I'm going to be using are grass green, golden ochre, sepia, and the white. And I'm also going to use the black at some point as well. So those are the colors that I'll be using from the watercolor pencils. And as far as the crayons are concerned, I'm going to be using orange, vermilion, brown, white, black, and I do believe that's it. Oh, and ochre. Yes, those are the colors that I'm using from the watercolor crayons. So basically, I just started out by using that scarlet color to draw in my tomatoes, base in the first layer of color along with a little of that golden ochre. And then I colored the leaves in with the grass green. Now I'm taking a short-haired synthetic brush, which I always suggest is the best for when you're using watercolor pencils to add water to the composition and disperse the pigment around. Now you don't want to add like a lot of waters. That's why I always suggest that you use a synthetic brush. You want to try to control the amount of water that you're actually adding to your watercolor pencils, and that same rule is going to apply for the watercolor crayons. You don't want to get it so sopping wet that you remove the pigment. You just want like a damp brush to liquefy the pigment and blend them together a little bit. So I always suggest just dipping your synthetic brush, golden Tacklon if you can, in some water, and then blotting it off on like a paper towel or a cloth in order to just work with a damp brush when you're dispersing that pigment. I'm doing the same thing with the number 2 round here to disperse the pigment in the leaves, and that is a synthetic number 2 round that Tim Holtz, if I'm not mistaken, and that's actually one of my favorite brushes, and it helps to move pigment with watercolor pencils around really well. So now you're seeing that I'm using that brush to pull some pigment directly from the lid of that scarlet watercolor pencil, which is another way that you can use them other than just sketching and drawing in color. You can pull the color directly from the lid with a damp brush. You would want to give your pencil time to dry again before actually using that pencil to sketch with after putting a damp brush on the lid. And now at this point, I'm going to use my white pencil just to kind of base and block in some color for the napkin that the tomatoes are going to be sitting on. And eventually you're going to see me go in with some black to add shadowing and to mix into the white, because the napkin is actually kind of a grayish tone, more so than a white, so it'll be a lot of shadows under the tomatoes. So at this point, I do believe we've dispersed out of the watercolor pigment, and now we're actually moving in with the crayons, which is what we will be using from here on out throughout this composition. So I based in some of the ochre crayon on top of the golden ochre first layer, and then I based the scarlet with the vermilion crayon. And now let's just lay down enough to cover all of my surfaces inside of my tomatoes. And now I'm going in with that exact same synthetic brush, and I'm dispersing that watercolor crayon pigment and pushing it around and getting those tomatoes filled in. Now you can see that these watercolor crayons are opaque. Now watercolor crayons and gouache tend to be the two mediums that I lean to more whenever I want something that's going to sort of put me in the mind of acrylic, because they're really opaque, but they of course are water soluble, so they lend to be blended a lot longer than acrylic would. And of course a lot less drying time than maybe painting with the oil. Which, you know, if you use water-soluble oil pastels, they're pretty much the same thing as watercolor crayons. They're all wax-based pigments in a crayon form that disperse when water is added to them. And I think I actually may do a water-soluble oil pastel painting coming up really soon for the channel, and go ahead and introduce that. I think that'll be really cool, especially since we're using crayons in this composition. And this isn't the first time I've used crayons on the channel, so you guys can always go back and check out the crayon review that I did earlier. But of course these are professional grade, and of course Caran D'Ache products typically come light fast with light fast information, and they are pretty pricey. You can buy them open stock, but and you can buy them in sets, of course, but you know, that's neither here nor there, and we'll eventually get around to reviewing these crayons on the channel before too long. So now you see that's where I'm blocking in the shadow on the napkins, and you're going to see that I also go back in to fill out some more of the white area in order to make sure that the black is going to mix to make a gray for the napkin. And then using the same brush that I've been using predominantly the whole time, I'm going to go ahead and just blend all those together. The leaves on top of the tomatoes, I told you guys we're done with grass green, and the color that I used from the crayons for the shadow color was moss green, and then a little sepia brown, instead of using black in it, I just kind of kept the black to the shadowing and the shadows in the napkins that the tomatoes were sitting on. Now you're seeing here that I'm actually basing in the shadow up under each of the tomatoes. Trying to remember to continue to do this. Wanted to make sure to ground that image to the paper, and so that you can kind of see the movement in the napkin or the cloth that they were sitting on. I'm really hoping that that turned out pretty well. I think it eventually came out well. You know, when it comes down to stuff like watercolor crayons, you have to just kind of keep layering. And then too, I was testing this paper, and this paper is not necessarily a blend type paper. It's more of a layering type watercolor paper. Now here you're seeing I'm going to be using a different technique with the watercolor crayons. This is where you actually taking them and putting them out on a palette. Now I took some sandpaper and scratched that palette up to make sure that it would grab pigment from things like watercolor crayons and pencils so that I can paint. So that's what I'm doing here. I've put that those crayons out on that palette, and now I'm using a flat synthetic number 4 brush to base in or to paint on my final layer of color. And again, that was the vermilion as well as the ochre and the orange from the crayon set. And I'm just back and forth and just kind of, making sure not to cover up my ochre part with my vermilion, but to get my vermilion deep enough for my tomatoes to look translucent and round and shiny. So that's what I'm going for. So I was trying to be heavy enough with the pigment to pull off that effect, but not so heavy that it just kind of looked dull. And then, I also wanted to make sure that the shadow carried the weight of what I was actually painting. Because, those tomatoes would actually be pretty solid. So that's kind of what gave the napkin up under the tomatoes their movement. Or I guess it's more of a tablecloth than a napkin. But in the end, it did kind of look how I wanted it to. So here you see I'm working some more on the leaves up top, and that's just where I'm going to take some green and I'm going to put it out on the palette along with that moss green that I used for my shadow color for the top. And I'm just going to use that number 2 round here to paint in and get the final layer on the little leaves sticking up out of the top of the tomatoes. Guys, I actually really had a lot of fun doing this. Now this painting took well over an hour, excuse me. And of course it may not seem that way because it was sped up. But I'm testing this paper, I'll say it again, and this paper really, I'm having to learn what to do with it in order to get the best effect out of it. And do stay tuned for that review, it will be coming up. And now you're going to see I'm doing a little separating of the leaves on the top of tomatoes with sepia. That's just sepia brown that I'm dipping into a little moss green, and that's what I use to kind of base in the shadow for each of the leaves and to make sure that they were kind of separated. Now I'm grabbing that black crayon and I'm going in and adding the darker shadows up under the tomatoes, where I was talking earlier about, them having weight and you being able to see how heavy they may actually be. See, guys, I've been doing a lot of studying and been paying really close attention to the things I'm learning in order to try to, include them into my paintings and grow. I mean, that's the whole point, is to grow and to become better. And I hope that you guys are picking up on tips and techniques and tricks and just different things that I'm able to bring and present to you that I've learned that is adding to your own art journey and your own art knowledge. I mean, there would be nothing more great, in my opinion, than to be a blessing and to be able to pass on just a very, very little bit of knowledge that'll help somebody else. I mean, that in itself would make everything I do all worthwhile. So yeah, we're just continuing to work on these little leaves up top, and I'm serious, guys. The more I painted and the more color I added, the more lifelike and round it became. Now it's not going to just be the most complete realistic looking tomato painting in the world. And of course, it's no masterpiece, but hey, I think I got the point across, and I think I showed you guys that you can actually take watercolor crayons and pour off a composition with them. And I'm going to be working with those watercolor crayons a lot more on the channel. We're going to try to get the artwork that we do with them more and more refined. And you know, when you're getting watercolor crayons, you should be careful because, you know, there are a lot of them out there, and the kids brands don't necessarily perform like the professional brands do, but that's not to say that they're bad, because I think the Faber-Castell kids brand of watercolor crayons, the 15 set that comes in their classic red package, I think they are actually really great, and I've used those on the channel before as well. So what you're seeing I'm doing here is going in and putting in my highest highlights, just using that white crayon, since I know it's really opaque, and adding in the brightest highlights I needed, excuse me, to pull it off. All right, if you like the things you saw, guys, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Go ahead and subscribe, comment, share, and remember, as I always tell you, just keep painting.